Welcome you to our Bible study today on the book of Job, Job chapter 27. If you will, turn in your Bibles to Job 27 and let's begin our study today. Job 26 to 31, Job speaks of his righteousness in verses 1 to 6. Here in chapter 27, verse 1, moreover, Job continued his discourse and said. Here, Job gives his final statement in Job 27 to 31. The next recorded break in the book, in the discourse of Job, occurs in Job 29, verse 1, with the words of Job ending in Job 31 and verse 40. In this chapter, Job maintains his integrity. Verse 2. As God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. Here in verse 2, Job begins with an oath, saying, as God lives. Just as truly as God lives, the Almighty, he will not speak wickedness, nor will he utter deceit. He believes that he is righteous and will speak the truth. Elihu later says concerning Job in Job 34, 5 to 6, for Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. Job believes that God has denied him justice and made his soul bitter. However, we know that while God had permitted the suffering of Job, he did not cause his suffering. Certainly not because he was wicked. Job's friends believed that Job suffered from God because of his own wickedness. And so Job sought vindication from God. Verse 3. As long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God in my nostrils, he continues the oath. This may be a reference to the creation of man, how God breathed into the nostrils of man the breath of life. Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Job's point, as long as he lives, he will speak the truth. Verse 4. My lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. So in verses 2 and 3, you have the oath, but in verse 4, you have the object of the oath. Here in verse 4, Job gives the content of the oath. He will not speak wickedness, nor will he utter deceit. Verse 5. Far be it from me that I should say you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. Job swears that he will never concede that Eliphaz, Zophar, and Bildad are right. He will never admit to them that they are correct. For him to justify his friends, to give a confession of wickedness, would to him be deceit. He will never deny his integrity, that he is innocent. Verse 6. My righteousness I hold fast, and will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. Job says that he will hold fast to his righteousness and will not let it go. He will maintain his innocence. He is confident that his heart will not reproach him as long as he will live. His conscience will not trouble him. Verses 7 to 10, Job describes the hope of the hypocrite. Verse 7, may my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises up against me like the unrighteous. Job now speaks of his enemy, saying, he who rises up against me. Perhaps Job means by his enemy, any who opposes his claim to be righteous. And so may his enemy, when he is judged, be punished like the wicked and the unrighteous. Verse 8. For what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he may gain much, if God takes away his life? The hypocrite has no hope beyond this life. Job says that even though the hypocrite profits, he has no hope if God takes away his life. He may have gained much here, but have no hope in the hereafter. Remember what Bildad said earlier in Job 8 and 13? So are the paths of all who forget God, and the hope of the hypocrite shall perish. And so he equates the hypocrite with the one who forgets God. Whether the man is a hypocrite who feigns to be godly when he is not, or the ungodly, his hope will perish. So what is the hope of the hypocrite? He has no hope. The same term for hypocrite is also translated as ungodly in a couple passages. Psalm 35:16 and Isaiah 10:6. Verse 9. Will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Job asks a series of questions. A negative answer is expected each time. First, God will not hear the cry of the hypocrite, the ungodly man who calls to God when trouble comes. In verse 8, he already mentioned by question that the hypocrite has no hope, even though he gains a lot in this world. If God takes away his life, he has no hope. And now in verse 9, he continues asking a series of questions. First, God will not hear the cry of the hypocrite, the ungodly man who calls to God when trouble comes. You know, sometimes people only call to God when there's trouble. Verse 10. Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? Second, the hypocrite will not delight himself in the Almighty. Eliphaz made an appeal for the man who has sinned that he should not delight in the Almighty, that he should delight in the Almighty. Job 22 and 26. Good advice for the ungodly, but Job was not an ungodly man. It did not fit Job in his situation. Job 22:26. Third, the hypocrite will not always call on God. In fact, he will not have the faith to call on God to begin with, or he will not have the expectation of a response coming from God. So no, the hypocrite, the ungodly, will not always call on God. In fact, he probably will not call on God. Or if he calls on God, he might only call on God when trouble comes. Verse 9. Job was no hypocrite. Job was no ungodly man, regardless of what his friends may have said, because of his suffering. According to the author of the book of Job, In Job 1:1, Job was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. When trouble came upon Job, Job cried out to God. His delight was in the Almighty, and he always called on God. The ungodly did not do so. Job certainly was not an ungodly man. In verses 11 to 12, we see that Job will teach his friends. Verse 11, I will teach you about the hand of God. What is with the Almighty, I will not conceal. And so Job says that he will teach about God's power over the wicked. He will not hide or conceal anything from them. The pronoun you in this passage is plural, which indicates that he is speaking to people, most likely his friends. He will teach his friends about the hand of God, which symbolizes the power of God, hand symbolizing power, such as in Job 1:10-12. Verse 12, surely all of you have seen it. Why then do you behave with complete nonsense? Here Job reproaches his friends. Job dealt with matters familiar to his friends, and he is confident that they have seen the hand of God. Verse 11. Why then did they need to be taught about the hand of God? Job says that they behave with complete nonsense. Some versions read similarly, such as they act foolishly or they become altogether vain. And so that word translated here for complete nonsense is a word meaning vain, futile, futility. Job earlier said in Job 21:34, how then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers? Job 21:34. Again, the idea of being empty or vain words. Job found no comfort in his friends' empty words, finding them vain. So here he says, why do you behave with complete nonsense? You're acting foolishly. Your words are empty. They are vain. And so he will teach them the hand of God. Verses 13-23. This is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage of oppressors received from the Almighty. These points are not in any kind of chronological order, but simply things that happen or can happen to the wicked. Job describes the ultimate end of the wicked. This is the portion given by God for a wicked man. Portion, inheritance. This is the heritage received from the Almighty. Here in verses 13-23. So he describes the hand of God upon the wicked. And ultimately, the wicked will be judged. Now, Job does not say that judgment comes immediately, always upon the wicked, but only that judgment will be his ultimate end. The wicked may even prosper here in this world, but ultimately he will be judged in the hereafter. If he's not judged here, he will certainly be judged in the hereafter. Job disagrees with his friends that just because someone suffers, this does not necessarily mean that the person who suffers is ungodly or wicked. Job disagreed with his friends on that point. Sometimes the wicked prosper, but ultimately they will be judged. And yes, sometimes the wicked are punished here in this world. But again, there ultimately be the judgment. Sometimes the righteous suffer, contrary to what was said by his friends. Verse 14, he continues talking about the hand of God upon the wicked. And he says, if his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. Even if the wicked has many children, even if his children are multiplied in number, the end of his wicked children will be the sword, and his offspring will come to want. So certainly if there are consequences for the wicked man, consequences that may even involve his children, there are also consequences that come upon those who practice wickedness, and ultimately the judgment upon them as well. If the children of the wicked, if the children of oppressors become oppressors themselves, they certainly will be judged by God. It may be that his children are innocent and they may suffer consequences because of the wickedness of their father. It may also be that they themselves become wicked in imitation of their father, and they become oppressors. Parents who are bullies often raise children who are bullies. Children often become bullies like their parents. In this case here, you have the wicked who are oppressors, and perhaps their children become oppressors themselves. And if so, they will be judged for their oppression. Here we see in the passage something similar to what Jesus taught. Matthew 26:52, we see a principle. Jesus said, put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. The principle of if you live by the sword, you will die by the sword, may be taught here in this passage as well. So if his children are multiplied, if he has many children, even if he has many children, it is for the sword. If they're oppressors, they may become victims of their own oppression. Verse 15. Those who survive him shall be buried in death, and their widows shall not weep. Job says that those who survive the wicked shall be buried in death. This death may refer to the death that comes from pestilence and plague or disease. As a result, the widows of the wicked will not weep for them. Bildad spoke of destruction, and again, perhaps disease, which devours the skin, and the firstborn of death, devouring limbs, in Job 18:12-13. His strength is starved, and destruction is ready at his side. It devours patches of his skin. The firstborn of death devours his limbs. And so he may be speaking poetically of death as disease, as death. And so some versions here in this passage for death read plague or pestilence. Again, this doesn't always happen in every case, but ultimately the wicked will be judged. Verse 16. Though he heaps up silver like dust and piles up clothing like clay. He may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. And so here in verse 16, he makes the point that the wicked may have an abundance of silver for clothing. It's like he's just piling it up in this world. He's heaping up all his silver, like someone might heap up a pile of dust on the ground. And he piles up clothing, like someone might pile up clay on the earth. Verse 17, he says, he may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. So the wicked may pile up these things in this life, but he will die, and ultimately the silver and the clothing will go to someone else. It may even go to the innocent, to the righteous themselves. And so the wicked may heap up silver and pile up clothing, but in the end, the just, he says, will wear the clothing, and the innocent will divide the silver. And the innocent will continue on and endure. Verse 18, he builds his house like a moth, like a booth, which a watchman makes. Job says how the wicked builds his house. However, as secure as his house may seem, his house is only temporary. First, Job says that his house is like a moth. How so? How can your house be like a moth? Well, a moth sometimes is a picture of something or someone who is fragile, like we see in Job 4 and 9, where he describes men as being like moths, crushed as a moth, or crushed before a moth. And so describing the fragile nature of man. It may describe here the fragile nature of his secure house. Second, his house is like a booth. This word booth describes a temporary shelter. And really, that's the nature of the comments that he's making here. Things that are temporary and transient, passing. So his house, even though it may seem secure to him, it's like a booth, a temporary shelter made by a watchman, which are by nature flimsy themselves. Some people put so much in their property and possessions as though they'll last forever. But ultimately, man dies and these things go to someone else. And the same is true to the wicked. But of course, the wicked ultimately will be judged. Verse 19. The rich man will lie down, but will not be gathered up. He opens his eyes, and he is no more. Job makes the point that the wicked will lie down rich, perhaps, but will not do it again. He will not be gathered up to his fathers or people. He opens his eyes and he is dead. Basically, the thought of these passages, this one included, is that which is transitory, temporary, passing, fleeting. So here you have the man lying down, maybe to go to sleep. But he's like the rich man of the parable that Jesus taught of the rich fool. He had all these plans, but he didn't know that that night his soul would be required of him. He would die, and he did. The rich man will lie down, but not be gathered up. The term gathered in this passage is also found in the expression to be gathered to his people, which is itself a metaphor meaning to die and to join his ancestors. For example, Isaac in Genesis 35:29, Jacob in Genesis 49:29, Aaron in Numbers 20 and 24, and Moses in Deuteronomy 32 and 50 were all said to have been gathered to their people or to their fathers. You can also see this expression in Judges 2:10 and 2 Kings 22 and 20, where they were said to be gathered to their fathers. So here in this passage, verse 19, he says the rich man will lie down and not be gathered up. So perhaps Job is saying something similar to what we see with the expression of being gathered up to his people or to his fathers. Here you have a picture of a man lying down and dying, not being gathered to his fathers. No happy reunion. He opens his eyes and he is no more. Perhaps he opens his eyes in the hereafter. And he finds out that his life here is no more. Perhaps that's what Job is meaning here in the passage. But basically the idea is that his life is transitory, it's temporary, it's passing, it's fleeting. And as secure as he thinks he may be in this world, his life will pass away. And ultimately he will be judged. Verse 20, terrors overtake him like a flood. A tempest steals him away in the night. Terrors overtake the wicked. He is afraid. Job uses three metaphors. First, there is the metaphor of the flood. The waters of a flood can rise up quickly and inundate the dry ground. One might think of a flash flood, comes up quickly and sometimes goes away as quickly after causing damage. And so he gives the metaphor of the flood. Second, he gives the metaphor of the tempest. The word tempest is another word for a storm, like a windstorm. The storm carries him away during the night. Now, one's sleeping when one expects to wake up in the morning. He doesn't expect to be blown away by a storm. But it could happen, nevertheless. Storm carries him away during the night. He thinks he's so secure in his house. He is like the chaff that a storm carries away. Job 21 and 18. Verse 21, he continues, he says, the east wind carries him away and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place. The third metaphor is the metaphor of the east wind. Some describe this as the hot wind blowing across the desert. It sweeps the wicked out of his place of security, and he's gone. He's gone with the wind. Verse 22, it hurls against him and does not spare. It flees. He flees desperately from its power. Verse 22, it. The pronoun it may refer to the east wind of verse 21. The east wind hurls itself against the wicked and does not spare him or show him mercy. The wicked man flees desperately from its power. Again, the word translated here as power is literally hand. Hand can be a symbol for power. Of course, the wind doesn't actually have a hand. That would be attributing human characteristics to the wind, which is certainly possible here in this poetic book. But we see here that the east wind, as it were, hurls itself against the wicked man and does not show mercy or compassion, does not spare him. Again, these characteristics are attributed to the wind as to a man. Here the wicked flees desperately from its power, from the hand of the wind. Sometimes someone actually may flee from the approaching storm. Here in the case of the wicked, we see the metaphor of the wind coming upon the wicked. Some versions here make the pronoun it out to be God. God hurls himself against the wicked. It's certainly possible. God is the one, after all, bringing judgment against the wicked. However, again, this is an interpolation. The translators have entered that into the text. It simply says it hurls against him or hurls against him. You might read it without the word it. If you do so, I think it fits most appropriately with the east wind of the previous passage. But again, it may be God bringing the wind against the wicked man. And again, he is the one who brings judgment. And so some versions may add the note that he's talking about God. Verse 23, last verse of the chapter. Men shall clap their hands at him, and it shall hiss him out of his place. In the New King James, when you see words in italics, it may indicate that these terms were added for clarity by the translator. And so if you read the previous passage where he talks about, I believe, the east wind, it hurls against him and does not spare, the wicked flees desperately from its power, the power of the east wind. Verse 23, shall clap their hands at him, or shall clap its hands at him. So he may be speaking again about the east wind, but the translators here have inserted the word men. And so Job concludes the chapter by describing how men will respond to the wicked. First, men will clap their hands at him. They clap at the wicked in derision. Sometimes people clap for different reasons, and the meaning of clapping can be different depending on the different cultures. You read about different occasions of people clapping in the Bible. In this particular instance, it appears that clapping indicates derision. And so here the men shall clap their hands at the wicked man in derision. And one such version adds in the words in derision, explaining what is meant by the clapping in the passage. And so to clap at the wicked means to clap in derision here in this passage. That is to ridicule or to scorn, to show contempt. Second, men will hiss him out of his place. Again, they're hissing in derision. In the Old Testament book of Lamentations, chapter 2 and 15, consider the following passage, an example of derision. All who pass by clap their hands at you. They hiss and shake their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that is called the perfection of beauty, the joy of the whole earth? So you can see in the passage how they're speaking of the daughter of Jerusalem with derision. They're clapping their hands at them. They're hissing and shaking their heads. I think of Jesus on the cross and how there were those at the foot of the cross who walked by, who shook their heads in derision at Jesus, who mocked him, who ridiculed him. Here in this particular passage, we see the final end, the judgment of the wicked. We hope that this has been helpful in better understanding this chapter of the book of Job, and we invite you to return next time as we continue to study this great book of the Bible. Thank you for being here today.